My colleague David Cunliffe, who I'm sure is about to speak on this bill, or possibly Raymond Whoa, who is also here, will be willing to elaborate on those provisions further.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Chairman, Labor supports this Commerce Commission International Cooperation and Fees Bill. It's a bill that was originally introduced by the Honourable Leanne Dalziel. It was then adopted by the Honourable Simon Power. Might be said a great loss to the National Cabinet, and it's now been taken over by Craig Foss, my former colleague on the Finance and Expenditure Committee. But since November 2010, unfortunately, it's been languishing on the order paper. The proposals in this bill are part of the work programme supporting the MOU on business law cooperation with Australia, and on that I'd like to make a couple of introductory comments. The bill aligns us with Australia, who passed similar legislation in 2007. It's not a matter of enormous pride for this House that it's taken us until 2012 to return the favour. Now, there's a couple of general comments that might be made about the progress of business law and competition policy in the two countries. The first is that Australia, because it has a larger, more complex, perhaps more nuanced political system than our own, Mr Chairman, did not embrace what we called Rogernomics with quite the same fervour or gusto. If I recall correctly, in about 1987, when I was offered a job at the Treasury, I turned it down because I did not want to enter a monastic institution where the religion of the land was something called neoliberalism, or we called it Rogernomics. And I'm very glad, Mr Chairman, that I made the right decision about turning that job offer down and went to work in MFAT before Murray McCulley was the Minister. I guess those were the golden days. But, Mr Speaker, since those days, the way that New Zealand approaches the closer economic relations arrangements, which of course was the brainchild of Tim Grosser in his own mind, but that's another story, has changed. Back in the 00s, CER was designed to pursue the interests of Australia and to pursue the interests of New Zealand, and to do so where those two interests mutually overlapped. And what has changed under this government is very, very significant. They have changed the purpose clause so that the MOU supports the joint increase in business well-being across both economies. And one might very well suggest that that is, in the language of economic geography, usually going to be in the nature of the interests of the stronger, larger partner, because we all know that if we were perfectly open to a single labour and capital market, that more of the smart money, the R&D, the big end capital would migrate towards Australia. So it is important, Mr Speaker, that we do at least this, that we incorporate into New Zealand law the sometimes greater protections that have been developed in that larger and more complex system. For example, Mr Speaker, in the area of telecommunications, a portfolio which I used to hold, we learned a great deal from the ACCC and its approach, that's the Australian Competition Commission, in relation to the regulation of telecommunications in Australia. And that was one of the things that became instructive in the way we approached the then virtual monopoly, the vertically integrated monopoly of Telecom New Zealand, and was one of the reasons we were able to benchmark the changes of 2006, which led to the unbundling of the local loop, the strengthening of the Commerce Commission, and, interestingly, the resulting doubling of investment in that sector, along with lower broadband prices and higher uptake. That was partly because we were able to benefit from the experience of our Australian cousins. Mr Speaker, much has been made of the international nature of transactions and the territorial limits of regulators being a reason why it's very desirable for regulators to be able to cooperate to manage competition and consumer effects of transactions across various domestic markets. And it's important for the House to recognise that the Commerce Commission is currently constrained from providing investigative assistance and compulsory acquired information that it holds to overseas regulators. Now, if it is the case, as is too often the case, that head office of a New Zealand company that's been bought up by an Australian parent or maybe another parent, and it moves across the ditch and the big strategic decisions are made there, there might be a bit of transfer pricing going on, so it doesn't pay too much tax in the New Zealand market, hypothetically speaking. And it's very, very important that when those companies are caught out by the New Zealand regulators, they can share that information with the Australian parents. Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable David
Chairman. Mr. Chairman, I probably won't take the whole next 5, but I do want to touch on several of the important... well, my whips are saying I will. Normally being one of those who's quite challenged to find the words to fill a whole speech, I'll force myself because the whips have asked. But, you know, such is the life of a parliamentarian these days, so I guess... As they say, the whips own my body, so I'm here to do their bidding. So there we go. So let's just dig down all seriousness for a moment and look at some circumstances where that information sharing power might be important. Well, for example, the Commission's statutory powers, that's the New Zealand Commerce Commission, of compulsion can only be used in relation to enforcement and adjudication within New Zealand. Well, that's not very useful if it's a trans-Tasman business and if the naughtiness happens to be going on at the head office across the ditch and they get the evidence here. They need to send the evidence to Sydney so we can catch the bad guys. No point in having the sheriff with the posse stop at the gate of the neighbouring ranch. Well, that's what we've got until we pass this law. Mr. Speaker, there's also legal constraints on the provision to overseas regulators of confidential, compulsorily acquired information that's already held by the Commission. And this in turn limits the willingness of overseas regulators to provide assistance to the Commission, such as cross-jurisdictional assistance that might be mutual. Another example, in a different sphere, is the way in immigration policy our officials and Australian officials have developed protocols to swap sensitive information on cases that cross the Tasman. There is no such similar power until we pass this bill in the area of commercial and competition regulation. Mr. Chairman, just a couple of words on the main provisions of the bill. There are two parts. Part 1 amends 3 acts. That includes Subpart 1 amending the Commerce Act, which is the substantial part of the bill, setting out the cooperation provisions with overseas regulators, providing for government-to-government cooperation, and new sections also procedural arrangements with reporting on the use of cooperation arrangements, conditions of providing information, the sharing and the maintenance of privilege, also very important in the legal world. Subpart 2 amends the Credit Contracts and Consumer Finance Act, ensuring that the changes to the Commerce Act apply to the CCCFA where references are made to consumer credit law and the Minister of Consumer Affairs. Mr. Chairman, Subpart 3 amends the Fair Trading Act to ensure that changes to the Commerce Act apply to the Fair Trading Act. Part 2 covers the fees that will be charged, and we have 2 SOPs. For the public out there, supplementary order papers. These are the last-minute changes that the government brings to the House to keep the opposition guessing, or because officials didn't do their homework in time. We have 2 of them today. SOP 274 introduces a new part because the original bill did not amend the Telco Act to bring it into line with the legislation. This SOP is in breach of Standing Order 2991. No, it's not now. That's good. The Super Minister sorted it out. That's very good. We're very pleased about that. Perhaps he's the next budding Super Minister.
Maybe he'll get education.
Maybe he will, because apparently it's going to be vacant soon, I hear. Or he may get one of those uniforms like Stephen Joyce has with the underpants on the outside and the long flowing cape. But I'm always confused. If he's Superman, why have they given him a department called Moby? Because that's a different fairy tale, right? That's Moby Dick, perhaps that might be what the underpants are about. Anyway, that's another matter. SOP 26 divides the bill into its 4 acts, and there pretty much we have it. A sensible bill. A sensible bill. I don't think anyone in this House would argue that this is not a sensible bill. It is, one might say, a trifle more sensible than the recent budget. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Craig Foss.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair.